throat. I'll mute.
Okay, so Kennan is the executive director of Reimagine Science, a nonprofit based out of Washington, D.C., which she co-founded in 2008 to facilitate change in the way we communicate and do science in the United States. Dr. Salinero has held numerous roles as a researcher in the basic sciences, including as a faculty member at Georgetown University in the Department of Chemistry, a basic researcher at UC Berkeley and the Joint Genome Institute in Microbial Genetics, and Abo Akademi in Turku, Finland. Is that how you pronounce that?
Abo Academy.
Okay, thank you. And in early career research positions at Los Alamos and Livermore National Laboratories. She was a scientific specialist at Celera Genomics during the sequencing of the human genome, traveling in the United States and internationally to explain whole genome sequencing technology and annotation methodologies, and conducting user trainings and beta testing on bioinformatics platforms. So a major focus of her work through Reimagine Science has been convening and co-hosting a wide range of interactive working events that bring together scientists and individuals from government, corporate, education, and nonprofit sectors. Third space events, global collab salons, science unsummits, and systems mapping events have been some of the means used to host key conversations and new thinking regarding how we do science. Theory U approaches to systems change was incorporated in the Reimagine Science tool set in 2012, and since 2017, they have hosted the Reimagine Science Hub on MIT's Presencing Institute's global platform, hosting learning journeys, workshops, and stakeholder meetings at the interface of academia and real-world systems. She currently serves on the East Bay Economic Development Association Employer Advisory Committee and was a multi-year member of the Innovation Tri-Valley Leadership Group STEM Education Committee. She has been a domain expert for the UC Entrepreneur Academy and Stanford's MediaX Lab Leadership Bootcamp, and a participant in the Palo Alto Leadership Program. Her extensive work as a TEDx organizer and within the TEDx community has resulted in several TEDx events in the Bay Area and partnership in the global TEDx organizer community development. So with that, I'm going to pass the ball over to Kennan for her talk on teamwork and the tech sector. Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christine. And that was quite an introduction. I was really thrilled to be able to prepare this, actually, not in the early days, but as it got closer, because I was able to go back through archives over the last 10 plus years, and it was quite a stroll down memory lane. So it's been really enjoyable already. So I'm about to start the PowerPoint, and I just have a request of you, Christine. Once I share, I will only be able to see my PowerPoint on my desktop. So if anybody raises their hands, or if there's any questions or something's not working, please just speak up, because I'll be able to hear you, but I won't be able to see anything.
I can absolutely do that.
Excellent. So here we go. Okay. All right. So I'm going to be talking about teamwork in the tech sector. As Christine shared with you, and I'll just go through these quickly, but I grew up in New Mexico, was at Eastern New Mexico University for my bachelor's and did research there. Los Alamos, I was working on inductively coupled plasma building, creating a spectrograph, being inside the box and building it actually. I was then at Livermore Labs for 2 years before I started graduate school at UC San Diego. In graduate school, I studied protein chemistry and looking at structure function analysis for the acetylcholine receptor. I'm going through the science part of this just to give you a feel of the context of where I come at this whole arc of discovering the tech sector from. And so from there, University of Massachusetts Medical Center, where I worked on protein translocation. This is secretion across the rough endoplasmic reticulum. I continued that work at Georgetown University, as Christine said, in the Department of Chemistry. After that, I was at Celera Genomics during the Human Genome Project. UC Berkeley and Joint Genome Institute were then where I did a genome project, where I had been very curious when talking about how the whole genome shotgun assembly worked for the human genome and why gap closure wasn't that important. I became very curious about what gap closure looked like and what finishing a genome would look like, which is much more handleable with a microbial genome. So I did the Chloromonas aromatica genome, closing the sequence, creating one single chromosome, and then doing the annotation. And that was, in many ways, the start of what launched what the original name for Reimagine Science was, Yamana, Science and Technology. Yamana means the highest form of living. And it was because when I was doing that work, the annotation part was the part of most interest to me, because that was the real strength of the Celera platform, were the Panther ontologies, which used hidden Markov models to allow proteins to organize to find their near neighbor partners across genomes. It's a very intensive hands-on computational approach, and I spent 2 years doing hand building hidden Markov models and organizing protein space across the different sequencing centers to understand the genes and the proteins that were predicted in the genome that I had sequenced. And this is where the trouble came in, because I found out that though we can use hidden Markov model techniques to self-organize protein sequences, the different sequencing centers were not self-organizing. And I think the moment of truth for me came when I was talking with somebody who had, we don't have a single pipeline. We didn't have a single pipeline to create the same meta-analysis. And this person had a very robust process and said, well, I can't really help that other sequencing center because I might lose my funding. And I realized that in the cracks of being in a competitive environment where each organization was trying to optimize their own performance, we were actually losing the metadata across genomes that this huge onslaught of genome sequencing had created, which has only gotten worse since then. And the reason that this matters is I am very aware. I have 2 sisters, I'm now a mother with chronic illness, but my 2 sisters have had chronic illness for most of their adult life. And I feel that the kinds of leaps and bounds that I would like science to make will not be available until we figure out how to cooperate and collaborate more effectively. So my journey really began with these 2 women. I'm out here in the Bay Area, and I had gone to, and I'll talk about the women first, but I'd gone to an AWIS conference that I'll give you the header for in a minute. But Krista Henley on the right partnered with Rosella Derrickson. Rosella is now at Stanford with the business school doing leadership development. And AWIS had hosted them to give a talk at Palo Alto Research Park on effective boss management. And this was way back in 2008. These 2 women had they oversaw the South Bay Organizational Development Network, where I began to attend. And there were 2 big surprises at presentations and in meeting people that were part of that organization that really, I don't know if it's me in particular or if it's because I came from the scientific arena, but these really blew me away. So one was around abrasive bosses, to even talk about that, to have a whole protocol about that. And the other was about self-aware bosses. So on the abrasive bosses, this was a talk I went to in 2011. Patrick Reilly and Deblauwe were working together at that point. And they gave a talk about how different companies in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley brought them in to work with what they called abrasive leaders. And what they found were the companies had invested a lot of money in these C-suite executives, and they were actually high performers. But they had an effect on the people around them where performance of people that worked for them was actually depressed. There was higher levels of absenteeism, attrition or turnover, which is very costly. I think it's estimated that a single turnover costs about a year and a half's worth of salary for replacing the person, legal actions, and even suicide. So lower morale, lower productivity matched with these higher rates of outcomes that you don't wish for. And typically, human resources responses have been to either tolerate the behavior, because after all, these are very productive people themselves, or terminate them. What Patrick and Tony did instead was to come in, and they would talk to the people that worked for this particular abrasive leader and get the stories about how that actually landed for the people that were in their fold. And then they would sit down with the person, and instead of being an event that was headed towards the door, you know, sort of the backlog that they had to do to show that they had given due diligence and they were going to give them a pink slip, they were actually there to help the person stay in the position. And the person knew that. And they would unfold the narratives that they had gotten from the people that worked with this abrasive leader and share with them what the costs of the behavior were. And 9 times out of 10, the person had no idea. They were doing the best they could the way they thought work needed to be done. Sometimes they were even in tears, but they wanted to change. And at that time, Patrick and Tony had a practice. They would come in and they would give them the tools and the processes for doing those exact changes. Another person that surprised me was Peter Stonefield, whom I met through the same network. And what I found out about Peter was that he had worked with C-level executives in companies such as Apple and HP, Sun, etc., companies that I consider to be sort of hard-nosed engineering companies. And he would work with them around their interior dimensions, their dreamscapes, how they felt about the world, looking at what was their process for thinking and how were they built as a human, which completely surprised me. I hadn't seen anything like this in the sciences at that time. I think things have changed in the 10 years since, but I still think it's pretty rare. Coaching is far more common now than it was then. Peter also, alas, had done studying of the impact of bullies in the workplace, surveying 200 engineers in 20 different Silicon Valley companies, finding the same things that the other researchers had found. And from one of the papers that he had shared with me shortly after we met, called Knowledge Bullies, he has a list of the kinds of behaviors: arrogant, condescending attitude, intimidating or over-controlling, judgmental, etc. And some of these likely will look familiar to you. I won't presume that everybody's had the same experience that I have, but certainly these are familiar to me, coming from many years in academia. I perhaps should not have been quite so surprised about this interior dimension, this self-awareness. I've learned much more over time. By the way, I'm going to present a lot of book titles and share a lot of names. It's not to try to tell you how many people I know, but I'm hoping that this is a resource that if you become interested in these areas that I'm providing the titles of books, that I found to be very useful in understanding this whole Silicon Valley approach to how work gets done. So this particular book was recommended by Howard Rheingold, whom I will speak about in a minute, Democratic Surround. Fred Turner was a journalist. He's now at Stanford. And Democratic Surround was a really, really interesting arc of history to follow. It started in World War II, Roosevelt in the White House, fighting fascism and looking at what was necessary to create the narrative with the American public to create a cohesive public. So this was all about creating culture. And he brought in Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson. It started this arena of the, I'm blanking on the name of it, but the story of man. I can't remember exactly the name of the installation in New York. It traveled around the country. This was about how we represent ourselves to ourselves as Americans. What were our societal values? And this arc continued through Black Mountain and these sort of be-ins, these artistic creative communities, Buckminster Fuller and his look at how the systems of the world are interoperable, synergy, all sorts of different aspects, and then lands right in Silicon Valley at the beginning of the era for the high-tech community. And that community was steeped in these kinds of ideals around creativity, around cooperativity. Use of mind-altering drugs was not unusual. So here we are in Silicon Valley at the end of this storyline for democratic surround. I will segue a bit sideways right now to say one of the first types of approaches that we were introduced to as an organization for our very first event, the one in the middle of the slide here in 2010, was open space. And open space technology was discovered by and sort of encoded by Harrison Owen. I was introduced to Suzanne Daigle, who was our facilitator for this methodology, by a dear friend, Tobias Meyer, whom I will also be talking about. He's the one that introduced me to Scrum. We did 2 different events in Washington, D.C. that were part of the USA Science and Engineering Festival. As you can see here, if you can read the fine print, Shifting the Effort-Reward Ratio in Science was in 2010. Innovation and Global Conversation was in 2012. We had a mapping of science event at the Presidio on the West Coast, and we've done several other meeting methodologies since then. Tobias Meyer was the person who had introduced me to Suzanne, and she convinced me actually to do open space as our meeting convening technique before I had ever been to an open space meeting. So I quickly went to one just to be sure. There was a Scrum Beyond software that was in Arizona in 2010, and that's where I met Tobias. I also have done a Scrum training with him. I've done Scrum training with a couple of other leaders in the Scrum community so that I could understand the technique. I'm not a Scrum master, but I will talk about it a little bit. One of the aspects, and Christine, this is a lot in service to what you had asked me about, which is Agile and Scrum. So I'm going to talk about these a bit more than the other technologies here. So Scrum is a particular way of structuring the workplace. It is called a scaffold. It has elements in terms of responsibilities. There's the product or project owner. It's usually called product owner, so I mistyped it here. The Scrum Master would be the facilitator. The best Scrum Master, according to several of the people that I interact with, is the one that doesn't really do a lot, that allows the group to operate on its own and just steps in when nudging or containing the process is needed. Scrums are a cycle of doing a project. They can be 2 weeks, a month, 2 months. And one of the basic underpinnings of Scrum is that it is meant to be highly dynamic and responsive to the environment. Daily stand-ups are every morning. There's a transparency element, and in daily stand-ups, you say what you have done, what you will do, and where you're stuck and need help. They're also massively parallel project approaches where everyone steps in to take care of where the challenges are, what the next steps are needed in a very self-organized manner. And there's a burn down chart so that you can see how close you are to getting finished, and very specific metrics as to what defines done. So Scrum was started actually earlier than Agile. It has 5 values: commitment, courage, focus, openness, and respect for others. And it was developed in the software community itself by software engineers because they were experiencing over 70% failure rates in terms of being over budget and over time. And also software was not responsive to the needs of the community. It was being operated as a manufacturing process as if it were linear in a closed system. And 80% of users were using, and still I think, use only 20% of the functionality. So that means 80% has been built for a very tiny group of users, and some perhaps never used at all. And they may seem really great and the perfect thing for the coder and the engineers, and yet not actually fit the needs of the user themselves. So one of the basic aspects of not only Scrum, but then it was more materialized in, I'm going to go ahead one more, in the Agile Manifesto, to bring the end user into the process and to check reality regularly. So these Scrums were about checking reality regularly, and the product manager represents the end user, and end users are actually brought into the process as well. One can call this evidence-based technology because you're looking at what actually lands and what is actually used. I'll go back one slide to The Cathedral and the Bazaar is a really interesting essay. When I got my copy, it was just an essay online. It's now in a book form. But the context of this is to look at what Linux was based on. And Linux is a highly distributed software development platform where there's a kernel that is stationary and that is enterprise software. But most of the Linux software is created by a highly distributed network of very invested programmers and software developers, coders. Eric has, in the essay, a lot of ways of investigating why he thinks this works so beautifully, and it created such a robust product because people actually value what they do. It's not the money, because almost all of them are volunteers, but it's the actual value of the product that they're creating and pride in their work. And there's a particular construct that allowed that to work well. Okay, so the Agile Manifesto came later. Agile is actually a whole set of methodologies. I'm going to go through the 2 pages of the manifesto. It's quite long in terms of the 12 principles. But just to take a quick look at this, it's, for instance, highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software, welcoming changing requirements even late in the development. Deliver software frequently, and on and on. I'm not going to read each one of these. It keeps going. But the manifesto was put together by software engineers because they were realizing that these closed methodologies that developed a product at the very end of the pipeline was not working in this highly dynamic world of software. So it currently includes many different frameworks of doing work together. I don't know about SAFe. It seems like it's a fairly new one, but Lean, Kanban, Scrum. Scrum is the one I know the best. One of the things that I am eager to share, perhaps, is that I was very struck in 2012. I went to a culture conference that was put together by Daniel Mezek. I will talk about him a bit more later. That started in Philadelphia, and then there was a bus of speakers that went to Boston, and it had the second instance of the conference in Boston. And one of the CEOs of a large company that was using Agile at that time shared that for 70% of the companies that had adopted Agile, it was a death march. And that really got my attention. Like, why would this thing that's considered the end-all and that is growing like wildfire be described as a death march? I checked in with Dan recently to see how that death march part was going. And I have a couple of things to share about this because I think it might be germane to team science. One of the things that I'm curious about is how much these inputs from the software and IT world actually overlap in science, because I'm sure that the human elements do, but I'm not sure the structural elements will. And so I'm planning to leave enough time to discuss that a bit. So the book on the right came out shortly after that conference. Culture Game is actually about the constructs that you use, the different processes or scaffolds that you use within the workplace environment to create a highly dynamic, highly hands-on, engaged community of workers. And one of the things that I still remember from the book, it's been quite a while since I read it, is Dan makes the assertion that middle-level managers and that people that are guiding work actually have more agency than they take, and that often they should just do the experiments rather than waiting for permission from the higher-ups. However, this is actually the part of Agile that has created that death march component of it. And from what I've been told by people who work in this area, Tobias, Dan, others, is that the disconnect is that if you're taking this highly hands-on, self-managed process for work and you're placing it in an organization that itself has not switched over to becoming a learning organization, which is a really hard switch. It's hard work to do. Then you are asking the people that are doing the development and the building to take all of the responsibility and to take on projects in a lean methodology that has a lot of feedback, that is always changing, responding to the environment, responding to the user, but you're keeping the overlayer of the hierarchical power context. And so you're telling them to make decisions and changes, but you're not giving them permission to make decisions. And if they don't have the authority distributed along with the agency for doing the work, it takes too long to go up the ladder and come back down for the major decisions. So Inviting Leadership is a book that Dan and Mark Sheffield just came out with. And it is based on 15,000 hours of hands-on facilitation that the two of them have done in companies around the world to look at where are these holdups. And that seems to be the major holdup, is you actually need to restructure the organization such that permission is completely given for authority and for agency to be given and distributed to these working groups that are building the things that are being built. One of the other aspects about Silicon Valley and the West Coast, Howard Rheingold, shown here. Howard was one of the curators of the very early internet community called The Well. He teaches an online course through Stanford University, funded by McCarthys Foundation, on cooperativity and collaboration. He wrote the Whole Earth Review. He was the publisher of the early online version of Wired magazine. And he studied with, and I meant to respell this, I think I've misspelled Elinor Ostrom, but Elinor Ostrom's work about the commons and cooperativity. And what you shouldn't miss, I think, is that not only Howard, but the many networks that he is connected to and the many groups of people and organizations that are part of his tribes, actually believes from his youth in the 60s that the world will not do well unless we collaborate and learn how to cooperate and collaborate as humans. And that in society itself as a whole, but also in the work that we do and how we operate and organize ourselves, we must come to the ability to work well together. And he has a large, very erudite, whole academic set of resources that really help to lay some foundation to this belief. Doug Engelbart is also a big influence. Doug passed away in 2013. He, in World War II, had happened to see Vannevar Bush's As We May Think article. He is best known for inventing the mouse. This is his prototype version of the mouse. But he actually has a number of people, both here in the West Coast, but also internationally, who either worked with him or are true believers of his beliefs. And his beliefs were in two domains. One was the technology. He had Dynamic Knowledge Repository, DKR, that he started. He created interlinks within documents that were then created by Ted Nelson as external links, or the XTML. He gave the mother of all demos in 1968, where he moved a mouse on a screen working from Palo Alto, and it was displayed in San Francisco. So the first instance of what the internet might look like. But he also had this other side that was less developed, but not less worked on. I think it's because it's more difficult, which was the human component. And he spent a lot of energy looking at how people in his groups interacted and trying to develop knowledge and wisdom around how humans can interact in teams. This is a small aside. This has also been happening in the aerospace industry. This is Bill Bellows, who worked with Ed Deming and had determined, even in a manufacturing pipeline or process, and has a lot of followers and a lot of people within his network that really look deeply at how teams work together. There's a cool exercise that Joe Onstott has created called Red Pen, Blue Pen, where you experientially, in a timed experiment, look at productivity for a linear top-down versus a self-organized system, and self-organized systems win hands down. They've been keeping spreadsheets on this every time they do instantiations of it for years now. So I have a theory about why I think engineering may have spanned this gap between the single brain and multiple brains earlier than I have experienced science spanning this gap. This is one of my favorite books. It is part of the Edinburgh Lectures. There's another name for it that I can't remember right now, but Absence of Mind. It actually took me until getting ready for this talk to get this quote and finally find it again. It may have been perversive destiny to array perception across billions of subjectivities, meaning that whatever happens in one person's brain can only really be known by that person. And this is a place that science struggles with, in that we have this N of one where we have to know that something from an external viewpoint is changing by perturbing the system and measuring it. And yet experience only actually happens in one head. For the software industry, this occurred as the chasm. One of the best descriptions of this was an engineer who created one of the largest compute farms of the time, about maybe 5 years ago in the Netherlands. And he realized he was so good with the computers that when he was on his off hours and the system went down, the technician that was babysitting it while he wasn't there swore that when he walked in the room, the computers would start humming again. So he was so in touch with his computer software and with the hardware in that case, and what he was building, that he was at the pinnacle of his own productivity. And he realized to get to the next stage, he wanted to do something that would take more than just him. And to work with more than just yourself, you have to bridge between your brain and other brains. And if you're truly, if you're going to actually get that collective intelligence of the whole group, it has to be more than one person can understand. And that's where the chasm comes in. A few people have independently discovered this. Jim and Michelle McCarthy worked for Microsoft. They were the creators. They headed up the team that made Visual C++. They had such a productive team that Microsoft had them train a number of engineers over many years. They then branched out and created their own, what is called the McCarthy Show. It's a boot camp. Many people have gone through their boot camp. If you go to their website, this is in fact what their website looks like. But let me talk a little bit about core protocols. Core protocols are, again, a set of procedures that allow teams to work well together. And the way that they work and they make teams able to communicate better is you look at your interior space and you use these small processes that allow you to get in touch with that and share it with others. So just a brief description. We in our own meetings use check-ins. In check-ins, you look and you say, I'm happy, mad, afraid, or sad. And then after self-reporting, because you have to pause and look and figure out which of those you are, you then say, I'm in. So they have a number of protocols that have been used by many, many different groups in the software industry and other industries. Project Aristotle, some people know about this. It came out just a handful of years ago. There's a long article in the New York Times about it. The actual study I don't think is publicly available. But Google had been following metrics around their teams, and they were able to see which teams had gone beyond the actual outcomes that they were charged with, and look at the people that were in the teams. Were they introverts? Were they extroverts? Were they eating lunch together? Were they socializing together? And they found that the personal characteristics were not correlate with high productivity. It was actually processes that created high productivity. These are the processes, but they actually come down to only two things. One is clear communication, and the other is empathy. I'm going to go through just a couple more slides because I really want to open it up to questions. So why it matters. There's consensus even in the scientific industry. I have an acquaintance who was brought in by Berkeley Labs to study what the failure rate was for their tech transfer process. And it wasn't the technology itself, it was the interpersonal part. Clean language is another tool that is used for how people can communicate together to get the processes that are in that space between two brains or between many brains to work clearly. One of the common aspects that I believe that in these processes that they all share are they're not actually intuitive, but it's amazing when you ask specific structures of questions, how it leverages the other person to make and have insights that they weren't aware of about their own thinking and to give clarity to you about why they would think that way. The last set of slides I'm going to talk about here are around trust, because trust and ethics are a key component around high-performing, highly productive teams and teams that stay together. Charles Feltman was one of the people that I saw give a presentation at the South Bay Organizational Network. He actually was going to give a presentation at our 2012 event in Washington, D.C., but luckily it was a small accident, but he had an accident with a saw, and so he allowed me to give his presentation on his behalf, and I'm still amazed at the different nuances and levels of trust. It isn't just about being honest, and it isn't just about trusting another person. It has a lot of complicated levels. So effective teamwork really requires trust. There's a group out here that I know, Resologics was formed maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Mark Barrell had done mediation work for a number of years, and his partner Diane has a background in law and also in mediation. And they have been doing a lot of work on discovering what different people's own sensitivity to trust is. They have an assessment tool where they can measure what your trust parameters are, both individually and within a team. Just a couple, I'm going to go through them very quickly here because I want to get off of the presentation and into the questions. But I think that trust is a major, major issue. And with that, I do have some other slides, but I'm not going to share any more here. I'll leave this one up for just a minute before I stop sharing. And I'd like to have questions. I'd like to hear, does this land? I have a big question about whether these same tools that were built in the software development and IT and tech community will actually work in academia. I mean, certainly tools around communication and trust would work, but I don't know about the others. So I'd like to hear from a few people.
Thank you so much, Kennan. That was absolutely fascinating and a lot of really great resources that you've shared with us. I'm super curious about this question that you've just posed about whether or not some of these tools would work within academia as well. Because as you said, I think there's some similarities in, we are asking, especially around incentives for promotion and tenure. We're asking folks to make decisions, and it's very self-managed, and decision making is very distributed, and yet there's this very defined hierarchy and structure. And so, but to the point that you made about having folks just dive in there and run the experiment. I mean, can we just run the experiment?
It seems like it. I am going to go ahead and share a slide because it's very germane to what you're asking, and I had a feeling the question would come up. And that is, I gave a talk with Doug Kirkpatrick at Stanford, and just a couple of months ago, looking at self-organizing systems and how it looks for their self-organizing system versus academia. So Doug Kirkpatrick is part of the Institute for Self-Management. He also is involved in a number of other organizations, New Focus, etc. He comes from Morningstar, and Morningstar is a large tomato processing plant that was started over, I think, 40 years ago, based on self-management. There are no bosses, no human bosses in the whole company. And they operate on only 2 principles. One keeps one's word, and no person shall dominate another. And I have been looking for years at what are the two operating principles for academia, and I think one is status and the other is grant or money flow. And the two principles are very, very different. And so we asked this question in this joint presentation at Stanford: could those principles work in academia, and how would we even get there? So, you know, even though you said it's distributed, and you know, when you're doing research in a lab, it's very much self-authorized. You know, you do have a lot of agency, and I think that scientists do feel like they are free agents. But my gosh, there's a lot of hierarchy in terms of whether you have authority and also what you must produce. So I don't know the answer to that question. I've been asking that myself. So it's really quiet. Do you have more questions? And also, if anybody is online, they can raise their hand, and I do have the screen where I can look at that. But without hearing anybody, I'm a little bit worried to make sure we're still connected.
I think everybody's still connected. Sorry, I was muted.
Okay.
Talking to myself. Yeah, does anyone else have any other questions they'd like to ask? Kennan, I'm curious how that that talk actually went with Stanford researchers. What kinds of things were brought up? Did people seem receptive?
Yeah, that I was really curious about that too, and I have something to say about that, and I do have something else to show. Oh, great, inviting leadership. Yes, I recommend in the chat, KM just wrote, fascinated by inviting leadership idea, plan to explore that. Yes, here's what we found in the Stanford presentation. I actually went through something that we got from Presencing Institute, 4 levels of listening, and in the 4 levels of listening, invited people to share with one another where they have experienced having agency in their academic setting and research and where they've been blocked. And it was surprising how much trauma there is in the system. So I think that one of the things that we likely will need to deal with in academia is that I don't think we've done it on purpose. I think it's a long arc of history. It's what, a 4,000-year-old institution, the ivory tower, going through major changes itself. But we found that that lack of having openness and honesty had had big impacts, which perhaps wouldn't have been what you would have predicted in a talk about complexity theory and agent-based modeling, but there you go. I did want to share another quick snapshot, which is this really great process for looking at the culture of any system. So Sadi Lalou, I saw him give a presentation at MediaX, so I'm just going to leave it in this format. It's easier to go back and forth. He has something called installation theory he's been working on for 30 years, and it's evidence-based because he goes into a system and he's able to cut it into 3 different sections. And one of the sections is the external parameters. This would be the physical plant in a hospital. It would be the actual hospital building, code scanners, computer system, hallways, carts, beds, all of that. The middle part of the system is, it's actually on the bottom of this triangle here, social regulation, but that's culture. And he posits that 90% of what we do in any given day is actually determined by social norms and social regulation. And then embodied competencies, that was the individual framing. And they used body cams when people would go over their day that was recorded. They had a lot of control over what was shared and what was seen, so there was a safety in there. But it was amazing how people could remember what their decision points were based on. And what I love about his theory is it allows you to take a system and cut it into 3 different levels to see where the issues are happening. And I think that that has promise for our academic systems.
There's a few questions and requests in the chat box. So one, sharing your slides from Tarun. A lot of good books and web-based resources. Yeah, and to Jennifer's point about being aware of the sort of caste system, Kennan, are you documenting this in any kind of systematic way in terms of the affect of how people are experiencing academia and academic science?
Yeah.
And who, if you're not, do you know of anyone that is?
So one on the slides, Christine, if you can help me, I'd be happy to deliver the slides to you so that you can distribute them. Would that work?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
great.
I can do that.
All right. And then in terms of your question, there are two things that, we are not documenting it in a study, a rigorous study-based manner, but we actually have a project that this event in Stanford was the launch of, and right now I'm dithering on getting it actually into reality. But it is our third space events. I will say before that, though, there are two things in our structural system for change, Robert Fritz's structural tension model. You first have a vision of where you want to go to, and then you look at current reality. So I'm not quite as interested at measuring how it goes right now. I'm much more interested in getting it to something different. But the impetus for change is to look at how it is right now and the cost of the current structure, very much like that abrasive leaders or approach to change. And in that, we have third space dialogues that we do with graduate students and postdocs, where we can be in a room, for instance, of almost 50 postdocs and graduate students at UCSF, where they have all kinds of support and alternative career training, et cetera. And we can tell you that out of the 50 people, one was positive about the future, one was neutral, and the rest of them were negative to very negative about the future. And that itself is data. So our third space track that we want to do next will take on from a design element that was introduced to me by two other very smart people, is to have a fishbowl where we have city leaders then have a second phase where postdocs and graduate students, where there's a lot of pain in the system right now, have that dialogue on a stage, and people can witness that and see that there's an issue here. So that's not a study per se, but it's definitely a way of gathering really important data for a purpose.
Excellent. That's really great. A few other questions coming in.
Yeah, I see the one, there's sometimes resistance in academia if ideas or tools for effective teaming come from the staff as opposed to another faculty member, regardless of experience with the tools. That's death by self, right? So I've been seeing this myself in different academic institutions where there's a comfort with the dysfunction. And I don't know how far that will go because the cost is so great. One of the things about this inviting leadership is that the premise that Dan has is the leadership actually has to buy in. And I don't know if there will be some universities where you get that and they move ahead quickly. Arizona State University with Michael Crow and Dan Sarowitz has some very progressive methodologies and very progressive mindsets. And so it's possible that that will be the proof in the pudding. Oh, hi, David. I know David Friedman. He was at one of our unsummits. Howard Hughes Medical Institute set up, yeah, Genelia, where scientists don't have to get grants. I'm going to tell you something about Genelia. Yeah, teams are required to be small. It would be interesting to see if they do science differently since they have reduced constraints from what academics typically face. That would be nice if it were true. Genelia, I know a bit about it. I knew one of the persons that brought in the whole genome shotgun sequencing ended up at Genelia. And one of my co-founders has a technician that worked at Genelia. And I tried to go to Genelia on one of my visits back east. It's a very closed environment. It's still inherited the top-down model. It's small teams and they don't have the same constraints. But I would say that, at the risk of not knowing what I'm talking about, but certainly my interactions with it, it hasn't really broken open the old model. All right. As with Jennifer, I'm very interested in tips and ideas on dealing with faculty staff design. Seems to align well with the abrasive leader. I think that one of the things that I didn't know, because I've run into this myself, I've had some really traumatic experiences actually in academia. And I've gone back and talked with those people that were involved at this point, having had a lot of training in communications and some training in having some courage, which doesn't come naturally for that kind of thing, which can seem very scary. I think that one of the best things a person can do is to become trained themselves for their own self-management and self-awareness. There was a term that was used, one of the reasons I left Georgetown, a number of us all left in one fell swoop. I think 5 of the junior faculty left by choice in a period of 3 years or so, is that I'm totally blanked on what I was going to say. See what the thinking about it even does to me. The ability to, they say that healthy people leave sick places. That was the term that was being thrown around a lot back then. That may be true, but I know that also one can intervene in surprising ways if you have some training and some coaching on how to do it. And I would say that for myself, I could be pretty good at being victimized because I am not naturally disruptive. I don't like conflict. I do what I call the bleed out on the playground response to people being abrasive with me. So that comes from an event in 3rd grade where someone was calling me out and punched me in the nose, and I just had a big nosebleed. I didn't punch him back because my mom had always taught me you don't fight back, you don't hit anyone. So I am very conflict averse, and I think that the most promising tool is to get training in conflict management. In fact, one of the people that came to Science and Team Science from Germany at my invitation last year, Rebecca Freeth, is working at Leuphana University, and she says it needs a little bit of heat, that you need to have some level of conflict to get really creative results in a team. Otherwise, people are withholding. So being able to deal with conflict is probably something that we would all do well to train better in. All right, so that's the end of the questions that are typed right now. And we're getting close to the end here.
Yeah, if there are no other questions, I'll just open it up one more time. Does anyone have any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Kennan. We really appreciate you sharing all of this really great information and your experience and some really, really great resources. The recorded webinar will be up on the InterReach webinar archives, and Kennan, maybe you could just quickly say your email address in case anyone needs to, or type it in the chat box potentially. Yeah. And if anyone would like to also go to your website, maybe include that in the chat box as well. We will see hopefully everyone back on the call next August 13th for the next InterReach webinar.
Yeah, then I'll end with, first of all, thank you so much, Christine, for inviting me to do this. I was amazed to dig through my notes and find my notes from these different events. And so it was really a pleasant experience to get this prepared. My email, just in case anybody is not reading the chat, is Kennan, Kennan, @reimaginescience.org. And also, we are looking at pulling together a learning journey around leadership, both pulling from the IT industry and from science and from what's emergent in science. So if you're interested in that, I'm interested in that. So know that that is one of the ways that we are looking at affecting change. is to pull together best practices by having a group of people involved in best practices themselves gather together and learn from one another and create something that can then be shared with early career scientists. So Christine, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Kennan. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.